Have you ever felt like no matter how deeply you care, something in your relationships just doesn't seem to flow the way it should? Like you're giving your energy, your attention, your presence, yet somehow it either overwhelms the other person or leaves you feeling like it's still not enough. Or maybe you've been on the other side of that experience where someone wants to get closer, wants more from you, wants more emotional connection, and instead of moving toward them, something inside you pulls back without fully explaining why. You don't consciously decide to create distance, but it happens anyway, almost like a reflex. And the confusing part is, both people can genuinely care, both can feel something real, yet the connection keeps slipping through their hands. This is where most people begin to question everything. They question the relationship, they question the other person, and eventually they begin to question themselves. But what if the issue isn't a lack of love? What if it's not about who cared more or who tried harder? What if there is a deeper pattern underneath all of it, something subtle but powerful, something that has been shaping the way you connect long before this relationship ever began? Because the truth is, the way you love is not random. The way you react to closeness, to distance, to emotional uncertainty, it follows a pattern. And once you begin to see that pattern, something shifts, not all at once, not in a dramatic moment where everything suddenly makes sense, but slowly, quietly, like a layer of fog beginning to lift. There are different ways people experience connection, and two of the most emotionally intense patterns are what many would describe as the anxious type and the avoidant type. These aren't labels meant to limit you. They're not boxes that define who you are forever. They're more like lenses that help you understand why certain dynamics repeat themselves, why certain relationships feel so magnetic and yet so painful at the same time. Because if you've ever found yourself in a situation where you feel deeply attached to someone who seems just out of reach, or if you've been the one who feels overwhelmed when someone gets too close, then you've already experienced these patterns in motion. What makes this even more complex is that these patterns don't exist on the surface. You won't always recognize them immediately. They show up in subtle ways, in the way you interpret a delayed message, in the way your mind fills in the silence when someone pulls away, in the way your body reacts to emotional closeness, either leaning in with intensity or stepping back with hesitation. And most of the time, people don't even realize they're acting from these patterns. They just feel the emotions and assume those emotions are the truth of the situation. To understand this fully, you have to go beyond just what's happening in the present moment. You have to look at where these patterns come from. Because the way you experience love today is deeply connected to what you experienced emotionally in the past. Not just in obvious ways, but in the smallest, quietest interactions that shaped your sense of safety, your sense of connection, your understanding of what it means to be close to someone. Long before you had the words to describe it, your mind and your body were learning how relationships work, learning whether closeness feels safe or overwhelming, learning whether emotional needs are met consistently or unpredictably, learning whether expressing vulnerability brings comfort or discomfort. And these early emotional imprints don't just disappear as you grow older. They evolve, they adapt, they become part of how you navigate connection without you even realizing it. So when you find yourself reacting strongly in a relationship, when your emotions feel bigger than the situation itself, it's often not just about what's happening now. It's about what that moment represents on a deeper level. It's about what it triggers inside you. Something that may have been there for a long time. For the anxious type, love often feels intense, consuming, deeply meaningful, but also fragile. There's a strong desire for closeness, for reassurance, for emotional presence. And when that presence feels uncertain, when the connection feels like it might shift or disappear, the emotional response can feel overwhelming. It's not just about missing someone. It's about feeling like something important is slipping away. It's about trying to hold on to the connection, trying to understand what changed, trying to bring things back to how they felt before. And this effort comes from a place that is deeply human, a place that simply wants to feel secure, to feel chosen, to feel emotionally safe. But the challenge is, the more that need intensifies, the more it can create pressure in the connection. Not because the intention is wrong, but because the energy becomes focused on preventing loss rather than allowing the connection to flow naturally. And this is where misunderstanding begins. Because from the outside, it may look like too much, too intense, too emotional, but from the inside, it doesn't feel like excess. It feels like survival. It feels like trying to protect something that matters deeply. On the other side, the avoidant type experiences love in a way that can feel just as intense, but it moves in the opposite direction. There is a desire for connection, but it's often accompanied by a sense of discomfort when things become too close, too emotionally demanding, too dependent. It's not that the feelings aren't there, it's that the expression of those feelings becomes complicated, because closeness can start to feel like a loss of independence, like a loss of control, like something that might eventually lead to emotional overwhelm. So instead of leaning in, there is a tendency to create space, sometimes subtly, sometimes more directly. Pulling back, becoming less available, focusing on other areas of life, anything that restores a sense of emotional balance. And from the outside, this can be interpreted as a lack of care, as disinterest, as emotional distance. But from the inside, it's not always that simple. It can be a way of regulating emotions, a way of maintaining stability, a way of protecting oneself from something that feels difficult to navigate. And when these two patterns come together, something powerful happens. There is often an immediate connection, a strong pull, something that feels meaningful right from the beginning. But over time, the differences in how each person experiences closeness begin to create tension. One person moves closer, the other moves back. One seeks reassurance, the other seeks space. And without understanding what's really happening beneath the surface, it can start to feel like a cycle that repeats itself no matter how much both people care. What makes this cycle so difficult is that both sides are responding to their own emotional reality. Neither one is trying to create distance or pain intentionally. They're simply following patterns that feel natural to them, patterns that were shaped long before the relationship began. And until those patterns are recognized, they continue to play out in ways that feel confusing, frustrating, and sometimes even exhausting. But awareness changes everything, because the moment you begin to see these patterns clearly, the moment you begin to understand why you react the way you do, something starts to shift inside you. You stop seeing your emotions as something that controls you, and you start seeing them as signals. Signals that point to something deeper. Signals that help you understand what you need, what you fear, what you've been trying to protect. And this is where real transformation begins, not by forcing yourself to be different, not by suppressing what you feel, but by understanding it, by recognizing that these patterns are not fixed identities, they are learned responses, and anything that is learned can also be unlearned, reshaped, evolved. It takes awareness, it takes patience, it takes a willingness to look inward in a way that most people avoid, but it is possible. Because at the core of all of this, beyond the labels, beyond the patterns, beyond the reactions, there is something deeper. There is a part of you that simply wants to connect in a way that feels safe, balanced, and real. A part of you that doesn't want to chase or run, but to exist in a space where connection feels natural, where closeness doesn't create fear, and where distance doesn't create anxiety. And the more you begin to understand these patterns, the closer you move toward that version of yourself. So as you continue listening, you may start to recognize pieces of yourself in what's being described. Maybe in the intensity of the anxious experience, or in the distance of the avoidant response, or maybe even in both. And that recognition is not something to resist, it's something to pay attention to. Because it's showing you something important, not about what's wrong with you, but about what has been shaping you. And once you see it clearly, you begin to realize that you are not stuck in it. You are simply becoming aware of it. And that awareness is where everything begins to change. And once that awareness begins to settle in, something deeper starts to reveal itself, not just in how you behave, but in what you feel underneath those behaviors. Because beyond the actions, beyond the patterns, there is always an emotional core. And for those who resonate with the anxious experience, that core is often rooted in a quiet but persistent fear. The fear of being left behind, of being forgotten, of being replaced without warning. It's not always loud. It doesn't always show itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it hides behind overthinking, behind the need for clarity, behind the desire to feel close again when something feels even slightly off. It can show up in the smallest moments, a delayed reply that suddenly feels heavier than it should, a change in tone that triggers a wave of questions, a sense that something is different, even if nothing has been said directly. And in those moments, the mind begins to search for answers, trying to make sense of what feels uncertain. But it's not just about the situation itself, it's about what that uncertainty represents. It touches something deeper, something that says, what if I lose this? What if I'm not enough to keep this connection stable? And so, the response becomes about holding on, trying to reconnect, trying to restore the closeness, trying to bring things back to a place that feels safe again. But the deeper truth is, it's not just about the other person. It's about the feeling of security that seems tied to them. Because when that connection feels strong, everything feels aligned. But when it feels uncertain, it's as if the ground beneath you shifts, and you're left trying to find stability again. Now, on the other side of this dynamic, the avoidant experience carries its own emotional depth, even if it doesn't always appear that way on the surface, because what looks like distance or detachment is often a response to something internal, a feeling that closeness, while desired, can also become overwhelming if it goes too far, too fast, or too deeply. There is a sensitivity to emotional intensity, a need to maintain space in order to feel balanced. And this doesn't mean there is no care. It doesn't mean there are no feelings. In many cases, the feelings are there, but they are processed differently. Instead of moving toward emotional intensity, there is a tendency to regulate it by stepping back, to create room where things feel manageable again. Because too much closeness can start to feel like pressure, like expectations that are difficult to meet, like a loss of personal freedom. So while one side feels a pull toward connection in moments of uncertainty, the other feels a pull toward space in moments of intensity. And both responses make sense when you understand what's driving them. One is trying to secure the connection, the other is trying to preserve emotional balance. But without that understanding, it can feel like opposition, like one person is asking for more while the other is giving less, like one is trying to fix something while the other is trying to escape it. And this is where the dynamic becomes even more complex, because these two patterns often don't just meet by chance. They are drawn to each other. There is something about this contrast that creates a powerful sense of attraction in the beginning. The anxious side feels something intriguing in the emotional independence of the avoidant side. It can feel stable, grounded, even calming at first. And the avoidant side may feel drawn to the openness, the emotional depth, the warmth that the anxious side brings. At the start, it can feel like balance, like each person offers something the other doesn't naturally have. But as the connection deepens, those differences begin to create tension instead of harmony. Because what once felt attractive starts to feel incompatible when emotional needs begin to surface more clearly. One begins to want more closeness, more reassurance, more emotional consistency. The other begins to feel the need for more space, more independence, more breathing room. And the shift doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, subtle at first, small moments where something feels slightly off, slightly misaligned. But over time, those moments begin to add up. And without realizing it, both people start responding more strongly to each other's patterns. The anxious side becomes more focused on the connection, more aware of any distance, more driven to restore closeness. The avoidant side becomes more aware of the emotional intensity, more sensitive to perceived pressure, more driven to create space. And this creates a cycle that can feel almost impossible to break, because each response triggers the other. The more one moves closer, the more the other moves away. And the more one moves away, the more the other feels the need to move closer. It becomes a loop where both are reacting to each other, but neither fully understands why it keeps happening. What makes this cycle so powerful is that it doesn't just create tension, it creates emotional highs and lows that can feel deeply addictive. Moments of closeness feel incredibly meaningful, almost like relief after a period of uncertainty. And moments of distance feel intense, almost like loss, even if nothing has officially ended. And this contrast keeps the connection alive in a way that feels hard to walk away from, because when it's good, it feels really good. And when it's uncertain, it feels like something important is at risk. But beneath all of this, there is something that often goes unnoticed, the way both sides begin to interpret each other's actions through their own emotional lens. The anxious side may see distance as a sign of fading interest, as a signal that something is wrong, as something that needs to be addressed immediately. While the avoidant side may see increased emotional expression as pressure, as expectation, as something that needs to be reduced in order to feel comfortable again. And so even when both people care, even when there is genuine intention, the communication begins to break down. Not because there are no feelings, but because those feelings are being expressed and interpreted in completely different ways. One is saying, "I need to feel closer to you to feel safe." The other is saying, "I need space to feel balanced." And without understanding the meaning behind those needs, it can start to feel like neither person is being heard. This is where emotional triggers begin to take over. Moments that might seem small on the surface begin to carry more weight. A change in behavior, a shift in tone, a moment of silence, all of these can activate deeper responses, not because of what they are, but because of what they represent internally. And once those triggers are activated, reactions become less about the present moment and more about the underlying pattern. For the anxious side, a trigger might lead to seeking reassurance, asking questions, trying to reconnect. For the avoidant side, a trigger might lead to withdrawal, needing time alone, reducing emotional engagement. And both responses, while valid in their own way, begin to reinforce the cycle instead of resolving it. But the moment you begin to see this clearly, something changes, because instead of reacting automatically, you start to recognize what's happening in real time. You start to understand that it's not just about the situation in front of you, it's about the pattern behind it, and that awareness creates space to pause, to reflect, to respond differently. And this is where the possibility of change begins, because once you understand the dynamic, you are no longer completely controlled by it. You begin to see the difference between what you feel and what is actually happening. You begin to question the automatic interpretations that once felt like absolute truth, and in that space, something new can emerge, because at the end of the day, these patterns are not about blame. They're about understanding why you react the way you do, understanding why the other person responds the way they do, and most importantly, understanding that these patterns are not fixed, they are learned, and anything that is learned can be reshaped with awareness, patience, and intention. So if you find yourself in this dynamic, if you recognize these patterns in your own experience, it doesn't mean you're stuck in them, it means you're beginning to see them. And that is the first step towards something different, not just in how you relate to others, but in how you relate to yourself. Because the more you understand your own emotional patterns, the more you begin to create a sense of stability that doesn't depend entirely on someone else's behavior. And from that place, something shifts. The connection becomes less about reacting and more about understanding, less about holding on or pulling away and more about finding balance. And that's where the real transformation begins, not in changing who you are, but in becoming more aware of how you've been relating and choosing, step by step, to move towards something healthier, something more grounded, something that no longer feels like a cycle you can't escape. And as that awareness deepens even further, something begins to stand out in a way that's difficult to ignore. The realization that this dynamic isn't just painful, it's also strangely hard to let go of. Even when it drains you, even when it leaves you questioning your worth, there's still a pull, a part of you that keeps going back, keeps hoping, keeps believing that maybe this time it will finally stabilize, maybe this time it will feel secure. And that's where the truth becomes a little uncomfortable, but also incredibly important to understand, because this cycle doesn't just hurt, it also hooks you. There's something about the unpredictability of it that creates emotional intensity. When connection is consistent, it feels safe, but when it's inconsistent, it becomes consuming. Your mind starts focusing on it more, trying to solve it, trying to regain control over something that feels uncertain. And in that process, the connection becomes more than just a relationship. It becomes something you're emotionally invested in at a much deeper level. Not just because of love, but because of the way it makes you feel when it's good, and the way it unsettles you when it's not. For the anxious side, those moments of closeness can feel like everything aligning again. Like finally, the connection is back, the tension is gone, the emotional distance has closed. And those moments feel so meaningful that they reinforce the desire to keep trying, to keep holding on, to keep believing in the connection. But when the distance returns, it doesn't just feel like a small shift, it feels like a loss. And that contrast between closeness and distance creates a loop that becomes emotionally addictive. For the avoidant side, the cycle has a different kind of pull. When there is space, there is relief, a sense of calm, a sense of returning to emotional balance. But when connection becomes too intense, it can feel overwhelming, like something that needs to be managed carefully. And yet, even with that need for space, there can still be a pull back toward the connection, especially when the emotional pressure decreases. And so the cycle continues, moving closer, then stepping back, then returning again. And without realizing it, both sides become part of this pattern that feeds itself. Not because either person intends to create it, but because each response naturally triggers the other. And over time, this pattern can start to feel familiar, even if it's painful. It can start to feel like this is just how relationships are: intense, uncertain, emotionally exhausting. But that belief is not the truth. It's simply the result of repeating the same dynamic without fully understanding it. And one of the most powerful parts of this cycle is the way communication begins to break down silently. Not through obvious arguments or clear misunderstandings, but through subtle misinterpretations that slowly build distance between two people who may still care deeply about each other. Because both sides are communicating, but they're not speaking the same emotional language. The anxious side communicates through closeness, through expression, through trying to bring things into the open. There is a desire to talk, to understand, to resolve, but when that expression meets someone who processes emotions differently, it can be received in a completely unintended way. Instead of being seen as an attempt to connect, it may be perceived as pressure, as expectation, as something that requires a response that feels overwhelming. And on the other side, the avoidant response often communicates through space, through silence, through stepping back. Not necessarily as a way of rejecting the connection, but as a way of regulating internal emotions. But that silence, that distance, can be interpreted very differently. It can feel like disinterest, like emotional withdrawal, like something is wrong that isn't being said. So both people are communicating, but the meaning gets lost in translation. One is trying to move closer and feels pushed away. The other is trying to create space and feels pursued. And without understanding the intention behind each behavior, it can begin to feel like the other person is working against you, even when they're not. This is where emotional triggers become more than just reactions. They become patterns that reinforce themselves. Because once a trigger is activated, it doesn't just affect that moment. It brings with it all the past experiences that carry a similar emotional tone. And suddenly, the reaction becomes bigger than the situation itself. A small shift in behavior can feel like a major change. A moment of silence can feel like a sign of something deeper. And the response that follows is not just about what's happening now, but about everything that has felt similar before. And this is why the cycle can feel so intense, because it's not just two people reacting to each other, it's two emotional histories interacting in real time. And when these triggers take over, both sides begin to act in ways that are meant to protect themselves, but end up pushing the connection further into imbalance. The anxious side may try to fix the situation quickly, to restore closeness before the distance grows, asking questions, seeking reassurance, trying to understand what changed. But in doing so, the energy can shift toward urgency, toward needing immediate resolution. And while the intention behind this is connection, the effect can sometimes be the opposite. Because for someone who needs space to process, that urgency can feel like pressure, like something they can't fully meet in that moment. And so they respond by pulling back even more, not necessarily because they want to disconnect, but because they need room to regain their sense of balance. And this is where the misunderstanding deepens, because the more one tries to fix, the more the other feels the need to step away. And the more one steps away, the more the other feels the need to fix. And without awareness, this can continue until both people feel exhausted, misunderstood, and emotionally drained. On the other side, the avoidant way of protecting oneself also comes with its own cost. Creating space can bring temporary relief, but it can also create emotional distance that becomes harder to bridge over time. Because while space may regulate internal emotions, it can also reduce the sense of connection that the relationship depends on. And if that distance continues without communication, it can begin to feel like disconnection rather than balance. And this is the deeper truth that often goes unnoticed. Both sides are trying to protect themselves, but in doing so, they are also protecting themselves from the very connection they want to maintain. One protects by holding on tighter. The other protects by letting go sooner, but both are responding to the same underlying need to feel safe in the connection. And when you begin to see it from that perspective, something shifts in the way you interpret everything. It stops being about who is right or wrong. It stops being about who cares more or who is trying harder. And it starts becoming about understanding the pattern itself. understanding what each response means beneath the surface. Because the anxious response is not weakness, it's a desire for closeness that has learned to associate uncertainty with loss, and the avoidant response is not indifference, it's a desire for connection that has learned to associate intensity with overwhelm. And both of these responses make sense when you see where they come from. But they also have limitations, because while they are meant to protect, they can also prevent the kind of connection that both people are actually seeking. And this is where awareness becomes more than just understanding, it becomes a turning point. Because once you recognize these patterns in yourself, once you see how your reactions are shaped, you begin to have a choice. Not an easy one, not an immediate transformation, but a gradual shift. A shift where you begin to pause before reacting, where you begin to question whether what you're feeling is coming from the present moment or from something deeper. And that pause changes everything, because it interrupts the automatic cycle. It creates space for a different kind of response, one that is not driven purely by fear or habit, but by awareness. And over time, those small shifts begin to add up. They begin to change the way you experience connection, the way you communicate, the way you respond to uncertainty. And this is where the real possibility of something healthier begins to take shape. Not through forcing the other person to change, not through trying to control the dynamic, but through understanding your own role in it, through recognizing how your patterns contribute to the cycle, and slowly, intentionally, choosing a different way of responding. Because at the end of all of this, what you're really moving toward is not just a different kind of relationship, but a different kind of emotional experience, one where closeness doesn't feel like something you have to chase or protect from. One where connection feels stable, not because the other person never changes, but because your sense of stability is no longer entirely dependent on their behavior. And that shift begins with awareness, the kind of awareness that allows you to see the pattern clearly, to understand it deeply, and to realize that while it may have shaped your past experiences, it does not have to define your future. And once you reach that level of awareness, something inside you begins to ask a different kind of question. Not why is this happening to me, but can this actually change? Because for a long time, these patterns can feel permanent. They can feel like part of your personality, like something you just have to live with. You might even start believing that this is simply how you love, intense, uncertain, reactive, or distant, guarded, self-protective. But the truth is, these patterns are not who you are. They are what you learned, and anything that is learned can be reshaped. Change doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't come from forcing yourself to act differently, while everything inside you feels the same. Real change begins when you start understanding your emotional responses at a deeper level, when you stop judging yourself for what you feel and instead start becoming curious about it. Because beneath every reaction, there is a reason. Beneath every fear, there is a past experience that gave it meaning. And the moment you begin to meet those parts of yourself with awareness, instead of resistance, something shifts. You stop fighting your patterns and you start working with them. You start recognizing when something is being triggered, and instead of immediately reacting, you create a small space, a moment where you can choose how you respond. For those who resonate with the anxious experience, healing begins by learning how to create a sense of emotional safety within yourself, rather than relying entirely on someone else to provide it. And this is not about becoming distant or shutting down your emotions. It's about learning how to stay grounded even when uncertainty appears. It's about recognizing that the fear of losing someone does not mean you are actually losing them in that moment. It starts in small ways, noticing when your mind begins to race, when it starts creating stories about what something might mean, and instead of immediately believing those thoughts, you pause, you question them, you remind yourself that not every feeling reflects reality, and slowly you begin to separate what you feel from what is actually happening. You also begin to reconnect with yourself outside of the relationship, because when your sense of stability depends entirely on someone else's presence, any shift in that presence feels overwhelming. But when you start building a stronger connection with yourself, your emotional world becomes more balanced. You still care deeply, you still value connection, but it no longer feels like your entire sense of security is at stake. And over time, this changes the way you show up. You begin to express your needs more calmly, more clearly, without the same level of urgency. You begin to trust that connection doesn't have to be constantly proven to exist. And in that shift, something powerful happens. The energy of the relationship changes. Because you are no longer reacting from fear, you are responding from a place of grounded awareness. On the other side, healing for the avoidant experience begins with something that may feel even more uncomfortable, allowing yourself to stay present in moments where your instinct is to pull away. Not forcing closeness, not overwhelming yourself, but gently expanding your capacity to remain emotionally available without immediately retreating. Because the need for space is not wrong, it's understandable. But when that space becomes the default response to emotional intensity, it can prevent deeper connection from forming. So the process becomes about finding balance, about learning that closeness does not automatically lead to loss of control, and that emotional presence does not mean losing yourself. It begins with awareness, noticing when you feel the urge to withdraw, when something inside you says, "This is too much, I need distance," and instead of acting on that impulse immediately, you pause. You ask yourself what exactly feels overwhelming. Is it the expectation, the intensity, the fear of being needed in a way that feels too heavy? And in that reflection, you begin to understand your own boundaries more clearly, not as a way to escape connection, but as a way to navigate it more consciously. You start learning how to communicate your need for space without disappearing, how to stay connected even while creating room for yourself. And this is where growth begins, not by becoming someone you're not, but by expanding your ability to remain present, to allow connection to exist without immediately distancing yourself from it. And over time, that presence becomes more natural. It becomes less about managing discomfort and more about experiencing connection in a way that feels safe and balanced. And as both sides begin to move toward this awareness, something new becomes possible, a different kind of relationship dynamic, one that is not driven by reaction, but by understanding, where closeness and space are not in constant conflict, but exist in a way that supports both people. This is what a more secure connection begins to feel like. Not perfect, not without challenges, but stable in a way that doesn't create constant emotional turbulence. There is a sense of trust that doesn't need to be constantly reassured, a sense of connection that doesn't disappear the moment something feels slightly off. In this kind of dynamic, communication becomes clearer. Needs are expressed without fear of overwhelming the other person. Space is taken without creating confusion or doubt, and most importantly, both people feel safe enough to be themselves without constantly adjusting out of fear. Because security is not about never feeling anxious or never needing space. It's about being able to experience those feelings without them controlling your actions. It's about having the awareness to recognize what you're feeling and the stability to respond in a way that supports the connection rather than disrupts it. And when you experience this, even in small moments, it begins to change your understanding of what love can feel like. It no longer feels like something you have to chase or protect from. It feels like something you can exist within, calmly, steadily, without losing yourself in the process. And this leads to the most important realization of all. You are not your attachment pattern. You are not the anxious reactions, and you are not the avoidant responses. Those are parts of your experience, but they are not your identity. Because if they were fixed, you wouldn't be able to observe them. You wouldn't be able to reflect on them. The very fact that you can recognize these patterns means there is a part of you that exists beyond them. A part of you that is aware, that is capable of change, that is not limited by what you've experienced in the past. And that is where your power is. Not in trying to eliminate your emotions, not in trying to become perfect, but in understanding yourself deeply enough that you are no longer controlled by unconscious patterns. In becoming someone who can feel fully, but also remain grounded. Someone who can connect deeply, but also maintain a sense of self. Because the goal is not to stop caring. It's not to stop feeling. It's to experience connection in a way that is no longer driven by fear. A way that allows you to be present, to be open, to be real, without constantly questioning whether it will disappear or become overwhelming. And as you move toward that version of yourself, something changes in the way you experience relationships. You no longer feel drawn to the same cycles. You no longer feel stuck in patterns that leave you confused or drained, because you begin to recognize them early and you choose differently. And that choice, that awareness, that shift in how you respond, is what transforms everything. Not just the relationships you experience, but the way you experience yourself within them. So if you've seen yourself in these patterns, if you've felt the intensity, the confusion, the push and pull, understand this clearly. It doesn't define you, it reflects what you've learned. And now that you see it, you have the ability to move beyond it. And that's where everything truly begins.